Hello, everybody. This is the Echoes of War podcast. I'm Craig from the Pacific War Channel. I'm joined here by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, wonderful to get back to our first series that we worked on. So really looking forward to today's episode.
And it's actually going to be the closing episode for the North African campaign. This episode, as you can see from the title, is the end of the Tunisian campaign, that aspect of it. But before we jump into it, I just wanted to give a shout out to my YouTube membership and my Patreon account that can be found at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast with over 26 plus episodes and counting. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And by the time you're listening to this, a poll should be up for the next episode. But that brings us to the episode at hand. We are now at the very end of the Tunisian campaign. And perhaps, Gaurav, you can just, for those who didn't listen to the last two episodes or need, a refresher, where are we at right now?
So I think we are now at the start of 1943, and the strategic situation for the Axis is poor, to say the least. So towards the end of 1942, they suffered a double blow from either side of the African continent, where in the east, Montgomery's Eighth Army defeated Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein through a slow, wear and tear, methodical approach, utilizing their material superiority. And with his overstretched supplies and inability to even supply and fuel his units, Rommel had to withdraw despite orders from the Führer to stay put, which usually would have meant a death sentence for almost any other person, like if they disobeyed such an order. So you have the Africa Corps and its forces in full retreat, moving towards Tunisia in their drive west. And unfortunately for them, on the western coast, you have a British and American set of landings, Operation Torch, which get Vichy France involved in the war now. So the French had a complicated situation in the way they dealt with the Allies. For example, with the Free French being recognized under Charles de Gaulle being recognized by the British, but Vichy France as a recognized government and entity by the Americans. They initially got the former French Third Army commander Henry Giraud to be commander of the French forces. And through political maneuvering, they were hoping that there will be minimal resistance. Then it turns out that Giraud is quite despised by almost every Frenchman, especially the senior commanders.
Oh, yeah.
And his audacity also shocked the Americans, especially Mark Clark and Eisenhower. Either ways, they do strike a deal with the French naval commander, Admiral Darlan, who commands the entire French fleet. He first orders an armistice to try to hedge himself against political repercussions from both Nazi Germany and Vichy France, which doesn't really pan out since the Vichy French regime pretty much ceases to exist after a month, with the Germans taking over the rest of the country and the French scuttling their navy. So as we have this, the Americans and British forces start driving east towards Tunisia. So you have two prongs closing in from either direction. And this is where we see Rommel utilizing the speed of his retreat. He's able to smash against the inexperienced American troops, winning at Sidi Bouzidi and the Kasserine Pass, which was a brutal baptism of fire for the green US troops. But now, and his intention was to try to send them reeling or buy enough time for him to properly prepare himself for the arrival of the Eighth Army, which is what he feared the most, as these are now the battle-hardened troops that would be, coming up. And at the same time, we have the situation where Hitler is pretty dismissive of his Italian allies, like pretty much every German commander of World War II. But given his obsession he had about the vulnerability of his southern flank, he starts flooding in a lot of supplies, men, material into Italy, Sicily, and then Tunisia. Supplies which were desperately needed on the Eastern Front, I might add. So now we are in the situation, the Battle of Kasserine passes over. Some supplies are coming in, but the Axis have to make their last moves, I would say.
Yeah, that brings us right up to speed. So Rommel had just given the Americans quite a shit kicking over the Kasserine Pass. I mean, it actually is one of the most devastating losses that they would face actually in World War II. And as you said, he's going to turn his attention to his old nemesis, General Montgomery and his Eighth Army, who are definitely not green. They are battle hardened. They have supplies because, of course, Montgomery will not even start an assault unless he's got all of his, ducks in order, as they say. And now Rommel is going to see what he can do to face off against the Eighth Army. Now, to just kind of cut into what he had just achieved at the Kasserine Pass, he had decisively broke the Americans and he caused an incredible amount of suffering. The Axis, in the process, they had suffered almost about 200 deaths, nearly 530 wounded, with 250 missing, and about 600 men were taken prisoner. They also lost 20 tanks, 67 other vehicles, 14 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, the Americans suffered 300 deaths, 3,000 wounded, with 3,000 missing. On top of that, the French allies, they suffered 50 deaths, 200 wounded, 250 missing. Captured Allied prisoners were well over 4,000. Alongside this, the Americans had lost nearly 200 tanks, 104 half-tracked vehicles, something, by the way, Rommel was really impressed with. He liked the half-tracks. 208 artillery pieces, 500 plus trucks, 57,000 gallons of fuel that I think Rommel really wanted, and 45 tons of ammunition, all captured by the
Uh,
Axis.
I would say one thing, given the strength of the deployed Axis forces, the the Allied forces, this is almost 50% of the committed Allied forces to the Battle of the Kasserine Pass for casualties.
Yeah, it's a devastating loss, and it's going to have enormous repercussions that we're going to actually be talking about. So
I
obviously the
think
oh yeah,
one thing I would just definitely add is just before the Battle of Kasserine Pass took place, the Casablanca Conference also takes place.
yeah, of
We
course.
definitely should. And I think the best decision that came out of that was the creation of the 18th Army Group.
Hmm.
So the forces of Operation Torch were grouped together as the first United States Army, and then you had the 8th British Army. So they just combined them to make the 18th Army Group. And the British Commander in Chief of the Middle East and Africa, Sir General Harold Alexander, is made, commander of this force, and he just reports to Eisenhower at this point. And this was
Definitely.
done to have an experienced general leading both armies and to ensure proper coordination because that was the biggest stumbling block for the Allied forces in the Battle of the Kasserine Pass.
It definitely was. There was many mistakes made, and communication was at the crux of it. Notably, Major General Lloyd Frendenall was replaced by very famous Major General George Patton, who's really going to come into his own now at this point. As you had mentioned, General Sir Harold Alexander is now taking control. And I do have a quote from the time period when he had to do the first report of his command. It is as follows: I am frankly shocked at the whole situation as I have found it. Real fault has been the lack of direction from above, from the very beginning, resulting in no policy and no plan. So, Mr. Alexander is not too keen on what's going on at the beginning. And likewise, on the other side, the Axis also are going to change things around. They're going to consolidate their forces into the new Army Group Africa. Of course, it's under Erwin Rommel. But after, the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, the Commander-in-Chief South, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, he orders Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnheim to launch two ambitious offensives, codenamed Operation Ausladang. Ausladang was intended to gain control of the Medjez el Bab, Beja, El Arusa, Djeb Abiod and a position known as the Hunt's Gap. This is between the British First Army and the Axis Army Group Africa. Now, they're also going to be unleashing an ad hoc division known as the Von Brosch and Von Manteuffel to recapture the Hunt's Gap specifically, while Operation Otzenkopf is going to be a spoiling offensive undertaken by Kampfgruppe Lang aimed at the 8th Army en route to the Marieth Line. So, time period wise, we're at about February the 25th, and Operation Ausladung sees paratroopers of Group Eidorf overrun the ad hoc Y Division at a place called Tally Ho Corner, Dejavot and Fort MacGregor. However, the British quickly recaptured Fort MacGregor and Dejava. Sorry, that was a brain fart there. Just before midnight, the 334th Division overruns Tally Ho Corner, pushing the Germans east at El Orasa, where on the 28th, Churchill tanks forced them to withdraw. On the 26th, Operation Otzenkopf now sees the Germans capture Sidi Nazir, easily dislodging the 128th Hampshire Brigade, prompting the Allies to fortify the Hunt's Gap. And afterwards, the Germans advanced to Beja, running into a tank kill zone defended by the 128th Brigade, supported by Churchill tanks. By the 28th, the Germans overrun the Allied positions while suffering tremendous losses. On the 29th, Germans down to just 6 operational tanks approached the Hunt's Gap, only to be repelled by artillery and the Royal Air Force at that point. By March the 2nd, the Germans now have lost 71 tanks, and 2 out of 4 German infantry battalions were taken prisoner. So the tide is certainly turning. Meanwhile, on the 26th, the Division von Manteuffel overran the poorly equipped Corps Français d'Afrique in the hills between Cape Surat and Sugina. And just to kind of explain a little bit, the Corps Franc d'Afrique were under the command of Joseph du Goulard du Malsabert, and he went on to fight Rommel's Africa Corps in Tunisia, as we're talking about now, and he was fighting alongside the U.S. Fifth Army. They fought alongside the British 139th Brigade at the Kasserine Pass and Sidi Nazar, where they were famously conducting a heroic bayonet charge facing 2-to-1 odds against the Italian 34th Battalion of the 10th Bersaglieri, near the mountain of Cap Zilia, on the road to Bizerte. And they would take 380 prisoners during that process, killing the Italian battalion commander and capturing plans for Operation Ausladung. They also would later participate in the capture of Bizerte in May of 1943. Just to, I guess, give a little bit of kudos to the French. Sometimes they're actually fighting admirably. And yeah, I'm one of those guys who's always going to poke the French.
Rarely, but
yeah. They need to be poked around. Okay. And on the 27th, to get back at the heat of the action, the British forces launched successive counterattacks, but by March the 2nd, the French forces prematurely withdrew at Medjed-el-Bab, allowing the Germans to overrun it at Beja. So after I said some nice things about the French, they done fucked up. On the 4th, the British performed a fighting withdrawal for 5 days towards the Djeb Abudod, and operations Ochenkopf and Ausladung were costly failures for the Germans. By mid-April, the Allies had recaptured all the lost ground and inflicted nearly 3,000 casualties, destroyed more than 70 tanks, 60 vehicles, and they captured more than 2,000 Axis men. The Axis had suffered 1,000 infantry casualties, another 16 tanks, 17 guns, 13 anti-tank guns, 40 vehicles, and of course, they had lost more than 2,000 prisoners. So, the tables had certainly turned for the Germans at this point. It seems that after the Kasserine Pass debacle, everyone was getting their shit together. Now, after the victory at the Kasserine Pass, Rommel planned a surprise attack against the 8th Army before Montgomery could actually attack the Marieth Line. On February the 28th, Rommel and his colleagues planned for an attack against the 8th Army at a place called Medinine. It was going to be codenamed Operation Capri, and it was going to call for the Africa Corps to capture a line from Hirenra to Ksar Riboten and then to circle north. The 10th Panzer Division would capture Medemur, the 21st Panzer Division would attack Hirksar Kutain, and the 15th Panzer Division would cut the road at Fum Tatahuni Medellin. Columbari, battle groups Speza and Trieste, and the Panzer Grenadier Regiment would frontally attack the Zemlet El Libyen, as the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica would bomb Allied airfields and try to provide some support. By the way, to the audience, I know a lot of you probably won't pull out a map. You really want to pull a map out for this episode because it's very complicated in Tunisia. It is not as straightforward as the rest of the North Africa campaign. It's a little bit more condensed here, and I actually just recommend just taking a look. Go Google it. It'll help out a little bit. So meanwhile, the
Yeah,
eighth.
I think we can just I'll just say that this battle, it's kind of towards the southeastern part of Tunisia.
Mhm,
That's where the main defensive line was placed right now.
mhm.
And this is, I think, as Rommel said, he understood one thing about Montgomery. The guy will not attack until he's properly built up and positioned his forces, and he wanted to exploit that.
Yeah.
And might I add, this was already starting to piss off some generals within the British Army that Montgomery was insufferable in listening to others or taking any sort of risk.
Yeah. Not to sidetrack, but
This is like the delicate balancing act. Yeah.
yeah, not to
But
sidetrack,
this
but
is,
I was actually I unfortunately sometimes I do dabble on Twitter, and I'm friends with Nitin from Flashpoint History, a fellow YouTuber, and I had put up a historical fact that just touched upon the North Africa campaign, and his immediate response was something like Montgomery was the dumbest piece of shit the British had ever put into World War II command. How dare, how dare he do the things he did? Like. I guess the Americans still have a big hatred for Monty.
he, well, to be fair, I don't know why he's put on the pedestal as the best British general of World
Oh
War
my
II.
God,
To
yeah,
me, it's
no.
simple. It's Harold Alexander. But Montgomery, he was a great trainer and planner. I'll give him that. And he knew how to manage a volunteer conscript army
Mm,
rather
mm.
than a forcefully conscripted army that we would see in the Soviets or Nazi Germany.
Oh, yeah. He certainly
He
understood
knew how to
logistics.
push them, but yeah, definitely. But at the same time, he did not know when to press an advantage.
Yeah.
So it was said that General Francis Tucker of the 4th Indian Division, which was part of the 8th Army at this point, after El Alamein, he was incredulous that Montgomery, first of all, like especially during the battle, he said, "Why is he splitting up our firepower?" But with the pursuit, he's like, "We should have been pursuing aggressively." They were completely shattered. The Montgomery allowed them to retreat. Otherwise, it was a rout.
Yeah, and I mean,
And
he also gave
this is
away
also
how he really did give away on multiple occasions exactly how he operated. Because as you said, Rommel by this point, he really knows the guy. Like it's
well, Montgomery has no tactical innovation. He knows
yeah,
how to execute in wear and tear. But in terms of putting his tactical brilliance or a new concept, he's not the right choice. Not even close. And this is also, I would add, where you could see that the RAF command is starting to really get pissed off with him. But because he won the first major victory for the Allied forces in the war, and he was quite good with the press, he was untouchable. Even though by now, Air Marshals Arthur Conyngham, Charles Portal, Tedder, they're like, oh God, we have to now put up with him. Because
yeah,
I would just add that during the retreat of the Africa Corps towards Tunisia, the Desert Air Force under Arthur Conyngham really wanted to gain supplies so that they could keep capturing the forward airfields quickly and then strike the Africa Corps as it retreated. And we all know that they've done an amazing job in disrupting the Allied Axis advance, hitting the supply columns, everything. But while the RAF is working overtime with whatever men they have to get supplies for their forces, he described while we are doing double shifts, Montgomery and the army are just working like a slightly less than a full-time shift for a day.
jeez, yeah, it's a pretty good critique of him. So back to the action. Meanwhile, the Eighth Army was, of course, because it's Montgomery, building up at Tripoli, and they were planning an attack against the Marriott Line. Montgomery dispatched the long-range desert group to survey a route through the land south of the Matmata Hills, deemed completely impassable for vehicles. The The long-range desert group found a narrow route designated as the Wilder's Gap, heading around the hills to the Tabaga Gap. On the 25th, Enigma intelligence warned Montgomery Rommel was about to attack on March the 4th, so he prepared a front line, and he massed his 25-pounders and anti-tank guns into tank kill zones. The Axis would be completely outgunned, and Montgomery knew exactly when and where they were coming. Again, the British, unbelievable intelligence during World War II. It really, if it wasn't for the Enigma breaking of that code, I really wonder what would have happened to the British overall in the war, especially when you think of just the convoys that would have been, sunk. Simply incredible. On March the 6th at 6 a.m., the Axis began a bombardment with tanks and other vehicles, charging the heights between Tujan and Kridach 90 minutes later. The 8th Army held their artillery and anti-tank gunfire until about a range of their maximum guns. At 8:30 a.m., Axis tanks converged on Decisive Kibir, running straight into a tank kill zone, destroying or damaging countless tanks as their Panzer Grenadiers were machine gunned down. By 10 a.m., the Axis forces fled 6 kilometers to the rear. And during the afternoon, the Axis infantry joined the battle, and at 5:45 p.m., about 1,000 infantry with tanks assaulted a place called Point 270, only to be completely devastated by the 2nd New Zealand Division's artillery. The Axis continued to hammer towards Tajera Kibir, making absolutely no progress. By 8:30 p.m., Rommel had to cancel the attack after losing 56 of his 142 tanks and suffering more than 600 casualties. Meanwhile, the British had suffered something like 130 casualties. And I just wanted to have a quick note here. Montgomery had actually written in his diary that, oh, yes, for the casualties, that he believed the 8th Army had suffered 130 casualties, and this would actually be recorded differently by other historians later on, who recorded the German losses to be 61 killed and about 400 wounded and 32 missing, with 33 Italians killed, 120 plus wounded, and 9 missing, with a minimum of 41 Axis tanks lost. The Germans would actually claim that 6 British tanks were taken out, 16 scout cars, 33 motor vehicles, 32 anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns, and about 51 prisoners were taken. Later on, and this is like in 1966, Ian Playfair, who's a British official historian, called the 8th Army losses trifling, and he recorded that more than 600 Axis casualties were accounted for, and they're mostly German, with more than 50 Axis tanks being taken out. What I'm getting at is
Can we just
historians are just trying to figure out numbers, and it was, not all battles have, even in World War II, where we actually have a pretty good understanding of figures. Sometimes it gets lost in translation.
well, it's quite difficult, right? Because casualties can be double counted,
Yeah,
or your unit strength info would be completely misjudged. But I think let's just talk about the key fact: the tanks were lost.
yeah. And we're talking about German tanks that are, it's not like they're irreplaceable, but the Germans don't have the means of repairing as well. They don't have the parts. They're not getting much reinforcements because convoys coming to Tunisia is actually going to be very difficult for them. And the Allies, not that they have inexhaustible amounts of tanks, but they certainly have enough to keep tossing.
And way better repair facilities.
Oh, yeah. And
I think it
yeah,
should. I know we mentioned it, but it just shows how much they cooperated because a German tank, even like the Panther, Tiger, or Panzer Mark IV, they won't be able to be serviced by the same guy or same set of parts. Whereas if you look at the Allied forces, even the Churchill tanks, Cromwell's, Sherman's, they had a lot of common parts. So you could
yeah.
just go to any depot and get it.
And thankfully, the British went along with American planners to just kind of standardize everything when it came to fixing vehicles and that. And yeah, they're all on the same page. I mean, the Allies simply worked more effectively together, whereas the Germans just looked. I would assume the Germans would look at the Italian tanks and just like spit in disgust and not want to, not want to have anything to do with those things.
Even armored cars.
Yeah, armored cars and
The,
cappuccino machines. I say this because my wife drives a Fiat, which, well, you know what? That's the descendant of some of those tanks, probably the same size. And yeah,
well, I mean, by that logic, anyone having a Mercedes-Benz or BMW today,
true.
It's
True.
descended from Luftwaffe engines.
Yeah,
Just saying.
very true. So by this point, Rommel is now convinced North Africa is a lost cause, which I think he probably was convinced of this a lot longer ago. But anyways, he cabled Rome requesting to just withdraw from the Marieth Line to a shorter position. When Hitler heard about his proposal, he furiously declined it. So Rommel traveled to Hitler's headquarters in Ukraine. This is by March the 10th, and he tried to persuade him to just abandon Tunisia, only to be forced to go on sick leave. So our great friend, longtime friend of this series, yeah, he's never
The
going to
Desert
set foot.
Fox.
The Desert Fox, he's never going to set foot in North Africa again. He is
The,
forced to walk away.
I will just say this. This is a massive blow for the morale of the German soldiers
Oh,
fighting there.
yeah. Yep.
Even some Italian divisions actually even respected him.
Even though he
And
spat on them. Yeah, yeah.
true, but they actually did perform quite well at even at times that so there was this armored battalion recon commander, Hans von Luck, who served with Rommel from in the Battle of France. He kind of got his promotions via Rommel, but he was quite good. And it was said at one point during this retreat, Hans von Luck, a German officer, sees the Italians fighting, and he even noted in his diary that there's absolutely nothing to fault these men.
There you go. So
But
now,
this
yeah.
is like the Africa Corps' morale has now completely gone. It's kind of like what the Eighth Army's morale was before Montgomery and Harold Alexander took over.
Well, it's very true. And well, back to Alexander. So now Alexander's plan is obviously to dislodge the Axis from Tunisia, and he's going to be performing this in two phases. First, the Eighth Army would pass through the Mareth Line and then advance between Gabes and Wadi Akarit, while the First Army would secure the dominating areas in the north to try and prevent the Axis from moving against them. The second phase would see both armies attacking towards Tunis and Bizerte, gradually choking the Axis. This is going to be codenamed Operation Pugilist. It's a very weird name, which would see a direct attack against the Marieth Line, manned by, at that time, the Italian First Army, interspaced with some German units, led by General Giovanni Musse. The 30th Corps would attack the line, while the ad hoc New Zealand Corps would hook through the Wilder's Gap to try and attack the Tobacco Gap. The 10th Corps would then pass through and exploit towards Gabes, with the hope of sealing off all the Axis forces to the south. Now, on March the 11th, the New Zealand Corps, they began a 7-day journey towards the Tobacco Gap, while on the 16th, the 50th and 51st Divisions began clearing minefields. By the 19th, the New Zealand Corps reached their assembly position as the 30th Corps began their general attack on the 20th. The attack began at 10:30 a.m. with a terrific artillery bombardment, followed by the 50th Division assaulting the coastal sector 90 minutes later. Despite having two full corps on hand, Montgomery inexplicably only deployed 2 battalions of infantry to initially assault the enemy defenses along a narrow front, which is, yeah, not
Montgomery.
really.
It's just Montgomery. Let's not even bother.
He is, and I hate to call him a very cautious commander because he is aggressive in his own right. It's not that he's not aggressive, but he really is kind of a very conservative commander. I feel like I don't know if and not necessarily that he didn't like to take risks, but I guess he's just unwilling to really take much
I
risks.
think, uh, or I don't know, from what I've really read about Montgomery is the guy was stubborn to the point that he's not going to consider any plan ever unless it's via him. He
Damn.
has to be the guy, the great genius that sets it up. And this was actually one of Alexander's two best skills that he had. One, he was able to handle Churchill and the political leaders very well
Hmm.
and cooperate with them. And he shielded Montgomery from that because if Montgomery was doing that, well, I think he would have had the sack in 2 weeks.
I mean, if you look at Montgomery's promotion to where he is, it's just because of endless people getting sacked. So it goes on, to say that Montgomery
And
could have been sacked too. Yeah.
and at the same time, Alexander had a good way of kind of nudging Montgomery to take his plan by making it seem like Montgomery was the guy who thought of it in the first place. He's
Yeah.
quite good at that.
And
He does it here. He does it during Husky quite a bit.
Yeah.
Most of the screw ups on Husky on Montgomery side, I will just admit, was just oh, where Harold Alexander did not really have a big role to play.
True enough. And even when he accepted command during the Battle of El Alamein, the first two, the first one, the second one, I mean, he was inheriting someone else's plans, and he just took it for his own. Montgomery didn't really change anything, so the fact that he got all the glory
Credit.
from that is kind of, anyways, a little bit sad. But I just
I just have to say one thing. Auchinleck was sacked for wanting to prepare for too long,
yeah,
and Montgomery used up more time to prepare than the
yeah,
Hawk
yeah,
ever requested from Churchill.
yeah. Oh my God, it's so stupid. So back to the battle at hand. Scorpion flail tanks, they were beginning to clear the mines as infantry braved machine gun and motor fire, scrambling up some high banks. Two battalions pressed through the wire into the trenches, zigzagging across defended localities into close quarter fighting, capturing Kizibi West and Urorzi by midnight. In the Wadi, Valentine tanks of the 50th Royal Tank Regiment crossed opposite of the Urorzi, but they found themselves stuck in the mud, halting the entire regiment behind them. The churning mass of armor attracted artillery fire, causing massive casualties, forcing the Allies to eventually pull back to their assembly area. On the 21st, the Allies were making some progress over the Wadi Zigzau, prompting the 90th Leichte Division to be brought over to help the Italian defenders. During the night, the 50th Wide Elements and the 51st Division, with elements of the 51st Division, supported by Valentine tanks, passed over the Wadi, creating a small bridgehead near the coast. General Messi then basically had to have the 15th Panzer Division deal with the bridgehead, while the 164th Leichte Division dealt with the New Zealand Corps, forcing its way through the Tepaga Gap. On the 22nd, the 50th Division found itself under heavy attacks by panzers, panzer grenadiers, and paratroopers, gradually being pushed back towards the Wadi Zigzau. Meanwhile, the New Zealand Corps, they were battling through the Saharan group, capturing Point 201 by midnight. On the 22nd, elements of the 164th Leichte Division and the 21st Panzer Division finally arrived, crushing the Allied momentum completely and ultimately thwarting a penetration of the Tepaga Gap. Thus, Operation Pugilist had completely failed.
Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself?
Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, Season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for Private Internet Access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/The Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
Now, on the 23rd, Montgomery formed Operation Supercharge Number 2. You know, with the first one was at the climax of the Second Battle of El Alamein. And this is going to be slated for the 26th. The 1st Armored Division would hook around the Matmata Hills to help the New Zealand Corps breach the Tabaga Gap and to advance to El Hama. 2 hooks would be made against the Meredith Line, the first through the Matmata Hills towards the village of Matmata. The second would assault through the Haluf Pass. As a preliminary action, Point 184 was captured by the 21st New Zealand Battalion at about 2:50 a.m. Now at 4 p.m., on the 26th, a blitzkrieg was performed against the Tabaga Gap. Kitty Hawks and Hurricanes with Spitfires bombed and strafed as Grants and Shermans of the 8th Armored Brigade stormed Point 201. Behind them, the infantry and carriers, escorted by Crusader tanks, breached the old Roman wall there, allowing the 1st Armored Division to exploit towards El Hama. On the 27th, the 15th Panzer Division attacked the New Zealand Corps on the right flank, but they were repulsed by about 9 a.m. Now, within the center...
Can I just say now,
Yeah.
now the Allies are doing the blitzkrieg quite well. And and we see this a lot on the Eastern Front more.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, when you are being attacked by this extravagant new technique, well, it's not new. I don't want to, because people will yell at me. It's not a new technique. It actually came about at the end of World War One. But when you're being attacked by this and you're seeing it just devastate you, obviously you're going to want to try and learn how to do this thing, or at least how to counter it. So everyone was becoming scholars on it, you know?
The funny thing is, the British and Americans were enamored by the paratroopers or the Fallschirmjägers of the Luftwaffe,
Yeah, of course.
which is why they use them so much. But they never really understood. They kind of conveniently forgot the part that paratroopers are light soldiers and they still suffered heavy casualties.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of was completely forgotten, and they kept making the same mistakes over. So, yeah, they do also copy the bad things as well. Just say.
Definitely. It's very unfortunate for paratroopers in World War II because the early days, you know, like you said, lightly armed, not specifically made to hold a position for very long, but inevitably their missions would be, hey, you need to capture this forward location, like an airfield, for example. You're going to have to hold on to it for, let's say, at least a day or two. And these guys would get counterattacked without mercy, and they'd have little to, you know, they would have little anti-tank guns, for example, against German armor. So yeah, it really sucked to be paratroopers often. Yeah. Back to the action. Within the center, the 164th Leichte Division and the 21st Panzer Divisions were now scattering as the British armor was plowing through exposed Axis positions as it began assaulting El Hama. On the 28th, General Messe withdrew his forces to a new line at Wadi Akarit as the New Zealand Corps captured Gaibes. You know, I'm just going to say this here. I apologize for my pronunciation. My brain is juggling between do I pronounce it in French or English, because in Tunisia, some of these locations are clearly using French terminology, and I'm just like on the spot as I read my notes going through that. I don't know, for people who are bilingual, it's like, it's really messing with me. I do apologize. But the 8th Army suffered 4,000 casualties. They lost over 51 tanks, and they would capture 7,000 Axis prisoners. The 15th Panzer, 21st Panzer, 165th Leichte, and 3 Italian armored divisions lost nearly all of their tanks and vehicles, while the 80th La Spezia and 16th Pistoia were completely annihilated. So yeah, the Axis took a hell of a beating in this. By the 30th, the 8th Army had captured Jebel Fantinaza, Wadi Akarit, and Romana, alongside another 4,000 prisoners. The 15th Panzers, the 101st Christe, the 164th and 90th Leichte Divisions counterattacked, but they were repulsed. The 8th Army simply continued their pursuit, seizing another 6,000 prisoners en route to Infadeville, where they were ground to a halt. The 8th Army, now at this point, suffered more than 1,300 casualties, and they lost 30 tanks in the process. But meanwhile, to the northwest, on March the 17th, the U.S. 1st Division captured Gaza, and on the 18th, the 1st Ranger Battalion captured El Ghoutar, with little opposition. But then at 6 a.m. on the 23rd, the 10th Panzer Division counterattacked El Ghoutar, initially overrunning the US front lines, but they soon became bogged down by minefields, and they were engaged by over 31 M10 tank destroyers, losing 30 panzers by 9 a.m. A second assault was made at 4:45 p.m., but American artillery simply repelled them, forcing their withdrawal and allowing the U.S. Second Corps to link up with the 8th Army around Gapes. So, the fighting at El Ghoutar cost the Americans nearly 5,000 casualties, 21 tanks, and 4 half-tracks, while the Axis suffered up to 6,000 casualties and 37 tanks were destroyed. For those of you who are probably like, oh my God, what actually happened in that incredible battle? Unfortunately, when I was writing a script for this episode, I was cramming far too much into a single episode. An episode is roughly about 2,500 words. So my notes were kind of limited. I had to pick and choose what battles to glorify. And if you're looking at the end of the Tunisian campaign, the battle for the Marriott Line is kind of the one that's talked about the most. So I had to pick and choose. So unfortunate.
Well, this was, you could say, like Patton's first true
Yeah.
command.
And it was Patton's,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, it is kind of indecisive, but it does show, I think this is the start of like that legend that the Germans would have for Patton, because he's decisive.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Well,
Rommel,
Patton,
he is
yeah.
decisive.
And I know people are not going to want to hear this stuff. I'll just say it. When it comes to leadership, think in terms of American presidents. What you always fear is the wrong decision being made. But honestly, other than that, the thing that should be feared the most is no decision being made. Commanders who are very hesitant or they take long to do things are the worst commanders by far. You actually want a commander who will make a bad decision if he does it quickly, most of the time. And that sounds kind of messed up, but not to say that Patton is like that, but Patton was very decisive, very quick. He was very full of himself, really believed in
But
himself.
a lot of the generals were. I mean,
Yes,
is Montgomery any exception to that? Rommel.
Of course.
But I think just to your point of the decisiveness, like General Neil Ritchie, when he commanded the 8th Army way back in early 1942,
Oh, yeah.
he was promoted so fast and he had not a single decisive action born within him.
It's very good to point
And
out.
a lot of his decisions were actually votes with him, his staff, and the divisional and corps commanders. And you contrast it to, at that time, Rommel. That guy, he has no sense of logistics compared to, like, say, a
Yeah.
Montgomery. But what he's not lacking is what needs to be done, and he'll get it done. At least he'll try to get it done. So, and even at the same time, within the British Armed Forces, you have Arthur Conyngham of the Desert Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is recorded. He listened to the opinion of other air commodores, army generals, etc. But when the orders go out the next day, no one is in any doubt that who is the person issuing orders.
Yeah, it's very important. Well, we're, for our generation, we're taught, power of friendship, working together, these kinds of things you see in the Disney movies. And it is important that military commanders listen to even their subordinates' advisements. But the commander needs to make the decision. It needs to be well known to his subordinates that it is him making the decision, and he needs to be decisive. It's crucial. Yeah.
It completely is. Otherwise, you keep a loose order or don't command the respect, you're gonna end up with insubordination.
Yeah.
Or people are going to interpret the orders in one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that could just completely derail your battle plans.
That's
pretty much what the British 8th Army suffered earlier in the North African campaign.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go down this rabbit hole, but for those who know their history about the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians had the capability to win that war, but their commanders were unbelievably incompetent. And the insubordination amongst the junior officers and stuff, it was crazy. And it's actually a huge reason the Russians lost to the Japanese. Just as a kind of an example of indecisive generalship. Like, oh my God.
Perhaps I'll just add one reason where we see decisive action helping within the North African theater is our dear sub-campaign at Malta.
Yeah, of course.
So Malta has pretty much been under siege, especially when the Second Flieger Corps is operating from Italy, and the Luftwaffe is harrying them. And even when they start getting convoys through fire and flying in ever larger amounts of Hurricanes and Spitfires, especially considering the fact that at the start of the war, you only had Gloucester biplane Gladiators as the primary aircraft there. We still have a situation where indecisive leadership has cost them a lot of supplies and aircraft. So, if I remember in one of the first early convoys of 1942 when it came, there were about 3 of the merchant ships that came in quite intact into the Grand Harbor of Malta, but they did not have the excess military personnel and dock workers. They kind of just worked the normal 8-hour shift. They did not get involved with the unloading beyond that. And next day, a couple of German Stuka's raid comes, and guess what happens to the 3 merchant ships? At least they learned their lesson. So Malta's fortunes really change when you have Keith Park, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park coming over, and he's a guy who knows how to mount a fighter defense. And considering that he was a big advocate of using small fighter covers. So thanks to him, you would always have a small number of fighters, not all the aircraft of Malta operating at any one point of time. So there is going to be, not only are they going to detect the raid, there will at least be some aircraft already ready to engage the Messerschmitts when they dive down. And that gives time, because the reason him and Dowding preferred these small packs, that is small groups of aircraft instead of the big wing, was the smaller groups are easy to form up in advance. So a lot of his fighter defense that he gained from commanding 10 Group in the Battle of Britain was really instrumental here. And you had the Spitfires really providing the air defense against the Messerschmitts, and also intercepting the Stukas. That allowed Admiral Cunningham to move back submarines to Malta. And they started to play havoc on the supplies that were pouring in to support the Africa Corps and Italian forces there. So in 1942 the Italian merchant fleet lost 67% of their tonnage. And most of it was sunk by the RAF, but 25% from the British submarines. So this is the Malta's 10th flotilla. And this is just an indication of the damage the submarines caused. British submarines accounted for 650,000 tons of shipping sunk in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And 400,000 other tons of shipping were damaged. And the British had one big advantage over, say, all but the Japanese submarines at that time. The torpedoes were quite good. They actually had about a 30% hit rate, which was quite good, especially if you compare it to the German torpedoes, which had quite a bit of errors with their contact pistols, especially in the higher altitudes where the magnetic interference actually played a lot of havoc, and the early American torpedoes as well. And then you also had the Bristol bow fighters, operating in an anti-torpedo, anti-shipping role. And they were also wrecking the convoys and also, warding off any enemy submarines. Donitz was anyways reluctant to, push U-boats into the Mediterranean, but he kind of had to because the Italian submarines were pretty darn useless in this area. It's not against the midget torpedo boats and the midget submarines because they were quite good, but they won't have the punch to engage in um, pure naval battles. So I think this is like a great start that we could look at is until July of 1942, on average, 92% of the supplies shipped over by the Axis were reaching the ports under Axis control. But over the last few months of the year, that came down to 60%.
Oof. Yeah.
Considering how much they were anyways short of supplies, with Rommel taking Churchill's gifts quite often.
Yeah.
This is really just choking them out. And the Allies knew this and were, using Malta to help in the you can call it a three-way joke. With the two armies advancing, Malta was strangling them from, you could call it a northern advance.
Definitely. No, the crux of the Mediterranean was the siege of Malta.
Indeed.
And now, coming back to the action at hand, the Eighth Army was advancing north towards Tunis, joined by the First Army from the west, whose U.S. Second Corps would attack Bizerte from the south. Alexander and Montgomery planned a large-scale offensive, while efforts were being made to thwart Axis aerial and sea supply, as well as any attempts to evacuate Tunisia. From the south to north, the Eighth Army, French 19th Corps, British 5th and 9th Corps, and the U.S. Second Corps would attack in unison, pushing back the Axis front line across mountains, valleys, and plains against formidable defenses and fierce counterattacks. The offensive began on the 22nd as the British fought a bloody amount of battles over key heights such as Long Top Hill. The 78th Battle Axe Division and Churchill tanks of the North Irish Horse Division began their assault on the 22nd against Long Top Hill's three prominent features, Djebel Amira, Sidi Ahmed, and Djebel Rahar. It took them about 3 days to capture Long Top Hill, but the British would suffer about 400 casualties in doing so, but in doing so, they would inflict about 1,000 upon the Axis. On the 23rd, the U.S. Second Corps would face daunting key heights such as Hill 609, which dominated the country for a few miles, and it was flanked on all sides by other fortified hills. It would take the 34th Division 3 days of artillery fire and infantry attacks to capture Hill 609, and 2 more days of fierce counterattacks to be faced after that. The Americans would suffer almost 200 deaths, nearly 1,600 wounded, and about 700 captured or missing. And the Axis casualties were expected to be equally heavy. What followed after this was 8 days of bloody fighting to cover the final 6 miles towards Bizerte. Meanwhile, the Eighth Army was taking too many casualties against Infidaville. So, to kind of explain, basically, this was a city by the coast, and it was under a large siege that was just taking forever. So, Alexander pulled the 7th Armored Division, the 4th Indian Division, and the 201st Guards Brigade over to assist the main thrust to be delivered by the First Army. As the Allies reorganized, Arnhem unleashed spoiling attacks between Mejez el Bab and Gubalat against the 19th Corps. The Hermann Göring Division, supported by tanks of the 10th Panzer Division, punched 5 miles through the Allied lines, but they were soon pushed back. Alexander then unleashed Operations Vulcan and Strike on May the 6th, seeing the 4th British Division and the 12th RTR defeat the Fallschirmjäger,
The paratroopers.
the paratroopers,
It's the Fallschirmjägers. So they were the Luftwaffe airborne
Fallschirmjägers.
infantry.
For someone who spent so many months in Germany, that hurts me to the core. I really screwed that one up. Of the Hermann Göring Division. Then the 4th British and 4th Indian Divisions concentrated their attack on a narrow front, supported by heavy artillery, breaking a hole in the defenses, allowing the 6th and 7th Armored Divisions to pass right through. On May the 7th, British armor finally entered Tunis as the U.S. Second Corps entered Bizerte. So, with the capture of these two key port cities, the situation for the Axis in Tunisia was completely hopeless, even as some continued to fight in isolated pockets. By the 13th, Arnhem and Messe surrendered their forces, seeing nearly 230,000 Axis troops taken prisoner. The Allies had suffered nearly 80,000 casualties, while the Axis suffered an astonishing 360 100,000. If I can, I'd actually like to break it down because I put it in my notes. Allied casualties, like I said, it's about 76,000, including the losses incurred by the First Army from November the 8th, 1942, and the Eighth Army from February the 9th, 1943. British and Commonwealth casualties amounted to about 38,000 men, about 6,000 were killed, 21,000 were wounded, and almost 11,000 were reported missing. For the Free French, they suffered nearly 20,000 casualties, about 2,100 killed, 10,000 wounded, with 7,000 missing. American casualties amounted to about 18,000. Wow, 18,000 casualties. That's a heavy load. Almost 3,000 were killed, nearly 9,000 wounded, with about 6,500 missing. So the Americans took a significant licking, and I mean some of that's owed to the Catherine Pass debacle. For the Axis, they had suffered about 300,000 to maybe 360,000.
I would just say that half of the US casualties were pretty much Catherine Pass.
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. That's why it's this one kind of battle that a lot of people know about, whereas most of the Tunisian campaign, American historians don't even pay much attention to it. They just kind of skip right to Sicily. But that Kasserine Pass battle is glaring. So on the other side, the Germans, they had suffered almost like 300 to 360,000 casualties. The losses, of course, are uncertain because estimates were pretty hard. But it's believed the German army suffered maybe 8,500 men killed during the campaign, while the Italians suffered about nearly 4,000 men killed. There's another 40 to 50,000 Axis soldiers that were wounded. In the British official history, Playfair, the historian, wrote that the Allies probably took something like 240,000 unwounded prisoners. About 100,000 of them were German, 89,000 Italian, and 47,000 others. Just to look into the fine figures. So all of the Axis tanks were destroyed or captured. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed alongside large numbers of shipping that was sunk trying to bring supplies to the beleaguered forces in Tunisia. The Axis had officially been kicked out of North Africa, and the Mediterranean was basically open to Allied traffic. It's not completely neutral or anything, but it's dominated by the Allies. The Allies had learned valuable lessons in desert warfare, logistics, combined arms operations, and of course, effective cooperation and coordination amongst different nationalities. Because we don't really mention this so much, but there's Polish involved. You got your Irish, your Scottish, your Canadian forces, Indian forces, Free
I mean,
French,
if you look at the
Greek.
British Eighth Army, I know there were South African divisions and brigades, Australian, New Zealand, British. Now you have the Free French, you have the Indian divisions as well within the Eighth Army.
Mhm.
On top of that, you now have the Free French, you had Vichy French, and you had the Americans.
And there's Poles and Greeks involved in all this. And
Yeah, Poles. I know there were like squadrons of their fighters.
I'm actually
Yeah.
currently writing, I guess I'm not giving anything away because it would seem obvious to those who are part of the Patreon or YouTube membership for the Kings and Generals channel. I wrote the North African campaign, I wrote the Mediterranean campaign, and now I'm beginning the entire Italian campaign. And it's actually during the Italian campaign where you see this interesting situation where the veterans from the Eighth Army, and even some veterans by that point from the Americans, they're pulled away from Italy after securing the beachhead to be brought back over to Britain because of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. And the commanders believe that the Germans wouldn't put up like an incredible amount of fight to, retain Rome. So they were going to supplement taking all these men with other groups. And these are like Algerians, Moroccans, even a Brazilian division is going to come over because Brazil declares war at some point. And they're going to be fighting in Italy. And what a brutal thing to do to these guys getting trained in Africa and stuff, to throw them against veteran panzers, Panzer Division commanders. And I mean, the Italian Socialist Republic, that's like the northern Italians that kind of fight on the side of the Germans. Not really. They basically all they did was kind of do anti-partisan duties. But yeah, some of the northern Italians did fight back. But yeah, the Italian campaign is wild. I'm in the midst of writing it, and it's a lot of fun. But my God, going through all the different lines, it's going to be interesting in the future. And you will be hearing about it more on Echoes of War. We are going to definitely dab into the Italian campaign, the invasion of Sicily, the battle for the Mediterranean, and all sorts of other stuff. Because I can't talk about it, but I think Kings and Generals has basically contracted me to work for the next 4 years. They've unleashed some major plans in the future, and I am fortunately or unfortunately going to be somebody writing a series that's going to last for years. That's God, I'm don't know how I'm going to manage it with everything else I do. But again, that's the end of the North African campaign. So as much of as it seems a little anticlimactic, but it's because I couldn't possibly dabble into all these battles. But as I had mentioned, these hilltop battles at the end, and that the British and the
I
American forces.
think the reason we call it anticlimactic is while you're fighting for a hill, you're not going to send an entire division there, right? It's
Yeah.
going to be regimental strength at most. You just don't have the space.
But you can
So,
you can see from the
and
numbers, the casualties are absolutely incredible from just these hilltop battles at the end.
true, but I think we should also just talk that this is such a blow to Hitler because in the last few months, not only has he seen the disaster at Stalingrad,
Yeah, and
where
not that it's the purpose of the North African campaign, but it has the dual effect of taking away so much resources from the Eastern Front. And this does not that it's what led to the collapse at Stalingrad, but it definitely helped for sure.
it did. You don't have the men to send you, or you have to divert. There were divisions diverted away from the Eastern Front, which started to move down towards Italy. And one of the big things Stalin kept insisting at the conferences was the opening of the Second Front, which we will see was why the British still continue to pester for a Mediterranean theater of operations and not the European theater.
I mean, if Churchill got his way, he actually wanted to get into the Balkans simply to thwart the Russians from taking all that territory, because that's what Churchill's mind was on, is, just retaining more and more of the empire and such. But that'll be for another episode. Before we go, I just want to remind the audience, and it's Christmas time, so it's relevant. If you'd like to further support the channel, please go check out my YouTube membership over at the Pacific War Channel, and you can check out my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. If you join either, you get access to the exclusive podcast with more than 26 plus episodes and ongoing. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And I believe you can do this with Patreon, but I don't know about YouTube membership. But if you're looking for a last minute gift idea and you have a friend or a family member that likes history, you can gift them a Patreon account for a month or more. Could be a unique gift. I have to say, the podcasts that are exclusive over there are thoroughly done. I really try to please everybody, and they're based off of audience needs. So, I really try to please. And
If you want, I can just say I loved your two-part series on the Big E.
oh yeah, that was a good one, definitely. And also, I have been saying this over at the other podcast I do for KNG. For those of you who are willing, please go over to my YouTube channel. You'll find my business email. Please email me critiques, criticisms, what you want to hear more from in this series or any other projects I'm part of. And for the first few who do so, I will be gifting some free Patreon accounts. So, Merry Christmas, as they say. Thank you, Gaurav, for going through this entire series, which kicked off, honestly, a kind of a new podcast, if you think about it. It's the channel's evolving, and we've got a lot more unfolding in the future. Everybody stay tuned, because there's big changes coming.
I'll just say beyond those changes, Craig and I are already planning so many different podcast series,
Oh yeah.
and we're not going to be just limited to the World War II era. That's all.
Oh, definitely not. We're going to go from antiquity to I want to even try modern today warfare. I am not an expert on, let's say, the Afghanistan operations, but I have a few old books on the Canadian campaigns in Afghanistan. I think it might be interesting for people, to look into that. And I could always also find guests who actually were in those campaigns to talk about it, because I actually do have some people in mind. I actually know one guy that was involved in the the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia during the genocide, and maybe if he's willing to talk, that would be an interesting story. Very dark, though, very dark. But yeah, until next time, over and out.